Hello and welcome back to the Insurrection Interviews podcast and to Magic and Ecology, the series of online and in-person events where we aim to think the uncertainty of this planet's future through the possibilities thrown up by the concept of magic or possibility itself. I am your host, Simone Kotver, and today I'm excited to be talking geopolitics, mysticism, and volcanology with Dr. Adam Bobbette. Adam completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge and is currently a research fellow at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. His first book, At Earth's Edge, Political Geology in Java, which is due to appear next year, uncovers the influence of Javanese mysticism on the emergence of the modern scientific discipline of volcanology. At the center of the book is Mount Merapi, an active populous volcano where Adam undertook an ethnography and comparative cultural history of shamans and volcanologists. Adam compares their technologies and practices of forecasting, institutions and networks, and the ways that telling stories of the volcano and its future are ways of defining what it means to be human. Adam's work challenges the reader to reassess the boundaries we often draw between scientific and mystical forms of knowledge, but also to discover that the two are implicated in one another and impossible to disentangle. He writes, "The differences between mystics and scientists were often not as stark as sometimes either of them imagined them to be. Reading a seismograph was often as mystical as spirit possession. Scientists understood Merapi as if it was speaking to them. What brought them together was their shared pursuit of finding ways to mediate, to speak for and with the volcano, and to do so in ways that negotiated, buffered, and complemented each other." Adam brings a political perspective to the question of magic, placing it in the context of urgent environmental and social concerns. He shows how both high-tech science and folk magic are techniques for, quote, conjuring the unseen and mediating what is invisible so that it becomes visible. Adam's work is a really wonderful case study of concepts that too often are invoked out of context or merely as metaphors, and we are delighted to have him with us here today. Adam, welcome to the Insurrection Interviews podcast and to Magic and Ecology.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you. I think I'd like to begin by asking how you first came into contact with the magical knowledge forms that you write about in your forthcoming book, and if there was a definitive moment when you realized their importance for getting to grips with volcanology, or if this realization was gradual.
Well, my first encounter with Mount Merapi was by accident. It was a number of years ago. I was in a taxi in the center of Java on the way to the airport. And the taxi driver took a left turn or something. And there was this kind of perfect cone, the kind of image of a volcano in front of us. And I asked the taxi driver what it was, and he said, that's Mount Merapi. And I soon learned that there were anywhere between 1 million and 2 million people living on Merapi. Merapi, by the way, is in the center of Java. And that it is also an active volcano, and it erupts quite frequently. The last eruption was in 2010, and hundreds of thousands of people became refugees for a few months. And I was really inspired and intrigued by this idea that there were so many people, essentially a kind of city living on this volcano. It seems so counterintuitive at first. Why would people live in a place that explodes, sometimes massively? And it seemed to me that I could learn a lot of things about what it is to live with uncertainty in a place like that. I also came to learn that people had been living there for a very long time, and so must then have developed some kinds of strategies for how to make sense of living on a mountain that explodes. So I came to this because I understood that, in a certain sense, Merapi and other volcanoes in Indonesia could be used as a way to think about our current condition more broadly. We know that we all currently live with a nature that is highly unpredictable and is becoming more so because of the climate crisis. So I live in Sydney now, and last year it was on fire. Many of us know the conditions of what it's like to live in a place that is now flooding. And at the time that I started to visit Merapi, I was also working on flooding in Jakarta, which is a city of 30 million people that is sinking while sea level is rising, and it floods every year, multiple times a year. So the volcano was really a kind of point of intensity through which I could investigate these much larger problems that I think are much more common than we might assume. In a certain sense, we all live on Merapi, I think. I certainly came to see that. So to continue that work, I pitched it as my PhD project and lived on Merapi for a year and circulated between the scientific observatory at the base of the volcano, which is one of the world's best volcano observatories. It's totally linked up with the United States Geological Survey. International scientists are there all the time. The scientists themselves are usually trained overseas, often in France. And the work that they do is really amazing. And then I would spend time at the top of the volcano in villages that are at the utmost edge of where it is that people are allowed to live. So that's about 4 or 5, sometimes 6 kilometers from the caldera. And it's a very different kind of world up there, impoverished, working class, peasantry. And I was encountering then very different systems for making sense of the volcano and what it means and how to predict it. Very different ideas about what the interior of the volcano is. And I would go back and forth between the observatory and villages. And I don't know if any of our listeners have ever been into a volcano observatory, but I'm not a scientist. It was really miraculous when I visited them for the first time, because there are these incredible spaces, the one in Merapi in particular, because there's like a big room that's full of seismographs, and those seismographs are all jotting ink lines on rolls of paper that are understood to be coming from earthquakes emitted from the volcano, the movements happening inside the volcano. People sort of scientists speak with a kind of ease about what's happening inside, though nobody has ever been there. And then I would go up to visit my friends in the village of Kuningar, and they would talk about how spirits come from inside and outside the volcano. Spirits visit them in dreams, they visit them in possession ceremonies. And they were both essentially kind of magical, strange things to me. And that's really sort of where things began.
And could you talk more about what you discovered in the magical knowledge forms? So these spirits that were said to inhabit the volcanoes, what were some of the practices around them that you discovered?
Yeah, so there's a complex pantheon of spirits that live inside the volcano and on the slopes of the volcano. The slopes are like, at the very top, it's all rocky, and then as you descend a little bit, it's forested, and there's remnants of old plantations, and then it's farmers' fields and rice paddies. And the pantheon of spirits are, for the most part, really old. So we have records of them from the 17th century existing there. We have records of spirits that used to live in other parts of Java and then moved in the 16th century to the volcano. Those spirits are often related to the sultanate, which is also at the base of the volcano. There are two sultanates. And the foundation of those sultanates dates to the 18th century. And in the creation of those sultanates, the sultan bases his power through a relationship between spirits inside the volcano and spirits inside the ocean, the Indian Ocean to the south. So there's the pantheon of spirits in there that are related directly to the sultan, the sultan's power. And then also when people die who live in villages, many of them think, though this is also contested, that your spirit goes into the volcano. So the volcano is ancestors of one's family and one's kinship networks, but it's also then full of the ancestors of the sultanate. So those are two examples, but it's a quite a complex pantheon, and it also depends on where you are on the slope. So different villages will have different spirits.
So I want to ask more about this. It's so fascinating the way you describe it, because one of the things I appreciate about your research is the earthiness, the kind of matter-of-factness of the magic and these practices that you write about. I think it's very easy, and it's certainly done all too often, to invoke magic and enchantment as metaphors with no relation to actual practices. This was something that we spoke about with Isabel Stengers in an earlier episode of the podcast. And just like Isabel's work, your research shows something different, shows to the contrary that magic is a highly political art as well as an environmental one. It's at base concerned with maintaining these sustainable relationships with the non-human creaturely world, which become the medium for the non-human spiritual world. As you write, village activists were also practicing traditional arts, including rituals, mysticism, magic, and spirit possession to fight corruption and drive the miners away. I found that to be extraordinarily pregnant. Could you say more about this in relation to what you found at Mount Merapi?
Yeah, it was really striking to me because I'm not trained in anthropology, a geographer. So I don't have the kind of background in literature on ritual that many anthropologists do. So I went into it as a kind of neophyte, really, and I thought that rituals were things that were pretty staid. They weren't so alive. But then, so in Kuningar, one of the problems, and this might be a little bit difficult to imagine, but there's a lot of sand mining. And this is because when the volcano erupts, it ejects massive amounts of material. So in the eruption of 2010, there was roughly over a period of 3 months of sort of continuous eruptions, the volcano exploded roughly the equivalent of an Empire State Building's worth of sand and dust and ash and stone. And all that stuff goes into these vast river valleys, turns into these deposits in these river valleys. The rivers are dry. They're just kind of conduits for this material. So after the eruption, there was a huge rush. It was a kind of El Dorado to go remove this sand and ship it away. Much of it ended up in mainland China and Jakarta and in reclamation projects in Bali and Singapore, where it's used in cement to make buildings. One of the consequences of this mining, this rush for this material, is that it destroys the riverbanks and it destroys the forests, and it completely upsets many livelihoods of people who rely on farming. Because suddenly you can just go into the river valley with a bucket and fill it up with sand, and the sand is so much more valuable than the rice or the chilies or whatever vegetables it is that you farm. So farmers give up farming and they enter into the river valley, and suddenly they're becoming really wealthy, much more wealthy than people who've decided to remain farmers. So it creates this social disequilibrium. And one of the strategies that my friends use in Kuningar is ritualized spirit possession, in which they have like dance parties that are just really amazing at night in the middle of the village, incredible music, and people get possessed with spirits. And those spirits require a shaman-like figure to speak with the spirit, to understand it. And what it turns out that the spirits were often saying was that they just hated the mining, because the mining is destroying the river valleys and people's livelihoods. So the ritual of spirit possession became a kind of critique of political economy, maybe. And it was mobilized directly in order to try to leverage the desire to go into the mines. That's one example of how it is that I came to understand that ritual is in fact political and is reinvented to negotiate a really pressing social, material situation.
And following on from this, you refer to your own discipline as political geology as opposed to simply geology. What difference does political make here, and how is it connected to these questions of uncertainty, volatility that you found?
I understand political geology in two ways. Maybe I'll give you just a bit of background first on what political geology is. It emerged a few years ago within a milieu of geographers. When I first encountered the use of the term and people who were working on it, I was really inspired to sort of engage it, because I've had a long-standing interest in rocks, really. And I've since come to think of the project of political geology in two ways, and it's not, by no means, not everybody thinks the same about it. But the first is that I think that we need critical accounts of the geological sciences and the earth sciences, because they have been so instrumental in furnishing us with narratives of the earth itself. And those narratives are inextricably linked, especially in the Western geological tradition, to the very crises that we inherit right now. So to give you an example, we would have no carbon-based economy if it wasn't for the geologists who defined what coal is and where it is, and made the maps that allowed people to go and dig it up. So I think that geology and the earth sciences and geophysics has this very fraught history in that it has both given us the basic language that we use to describe the Earth, the language that we use to think about deep time and an Earth that's 4.5 billion years old. But it is also responsible for the production of global capitalism. So for me, what political geology does is tries to not shy away from those histories and to be accountable to them. The second thing that I think political geology does is understands that geology, the geological sciences, the earth sciences were never just a Western project. So there are alternative traditions, geological traditions. There are alternative traditions of thinking about the structure and evolution of the earth. There are alternative traditions of thinking about what it is that's inside the earth. And I've set this up in a kind of simple dichotomy, but the fact is that it's also not a dichotomy. So these traditions have also been in conversation for a really long time and transforming each other. So really the purpose of the book then is to say that there's a tradition of geological thought in Java, which is Javanese mysticism. And Javanese mysticism has in fact shaped and transformed Western geological sciences and has in fact contributed to our very understanding of our modern understanding of the earth itself. But then that tradition is also in excess and beyond the Western geological tradition.
Following on from this, I'd like to ask more about the role that magic plays in the critique of Western epistemology that's working in your book. So in your book, you write about the need to correct legacies of the geological sciences by showing that it has been a tool of European colonization and empire building and transformed by the cultures it encountered. So I interpret this as a warning against separating too neatly between Western and non-Western epistemologies. The realities are more complex, and I'm reminded of the fantastic line in your book where you say, quote, "I drank tea with Javanese mystics trained as seismologists and seismologists that meditated on the meaning of nothingness." I'd love to hear more about this experience and also the scholarship that you have found useful or not so useful in addressing it.
What I just described about political geology is that it does, as you say, try to hold these two things together at the same time, which is that there is such a thing as a Western geological tradition. We can point to it and we can point to what it has done. And then there are traditions which are not Western, have emerged independently with amazing histories. But then, of course, we would totally want to avoid any kind of simple West, non-West separation, even though that's exactly what I just did. And then, and so avoiding that is by the way that I do it is to show these lines of influence and exchange. So it's a kind of core contradiction, but I think it's real. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
The question is, to what extent does the magical practices of the Javanese mystics present a critique of Western epistemology, but also a kind of way for the quote unquote Western epistemology to recognize itself?
Well, maybe I can answer this by telling a short story. So as I mentioned earlier, the pantheon of spirits who live in Merapi are related to the sultanate, one of the sultanates at the base of the volcano. One of the founding stories of that sultanate, it's the Yogyakarta Sultanate, is that this enterprising descendant of royalty was wanting to found a kingdom of his own. And he wanted to found an Islamic kingdom in what then was primarily Hindu and Buddhist Java. And so he goes on a trip to find divine inspiration, and he ends up at the base of, or at the beach of the Indian Ocean, where he meets Nyai Ratu Kidul, who's the goddess of the South Sea. And they sleep together. She gives him all sorts of advice on how to found a kingdom and promises sort of perpetual protection. At the same time, she creates this giant who is then sent to live in the volcano. And that giant also promises, perpetual protection of the kingdom from its explosions and eruptions. There's all sorts of conditions of how it is that, of what it is that he is supposed to do, the proto-sultan, in order to, he has a part of the bargain that he has to keep up as well. But this is the founding story. So then he goes on to build his kingdom. Every year, there's ritual procession that leaves from the Sultanate to the South Sea, where that first sultan met the goddess of the South Sea. And then they go up to the top of the volcano and give offerings to the volcano, to the giant who lives in the volcano. As a part of this, the sultan appoints somebody who's called a gatekeeper, who lives at either end of, or at both of these places of where offerings are given, in order to sort of do the role of the sultan in absentia. So the gatekeeper lives there and gives offerings and takes care of graveyards and shows people around, things like that. Now, in the 2010 eruption, the gatekeeper on the volcano was refusing to leave the volcano, because the current sultan, he thought, had essentially lost his way and had become a greedy capitalist. He was building hotels and golf courses on the volcano and stuff. So the gatekeeper said, I no longer recognize you as my sultan. And the sultan said, the volcano is exploding. Scientists were like, the volcano is exploding. The media was like, the volcano is exploding. And the gatekeeper said, I don't care. I am here to work with the spirits of the volcano. At that time, one of Indonesia's most famous scientists, a guy named Surono, a seismologist, who was the head of the Volcanological Survey, came out in public and criticized the gatekeeper as believing in voodoo. And he's like, these backwards rural people with all their superstitious beliefs, what you need to do is you need to listen to science. And I'm a scientist and I know what's happening inside the volcano. In the end, Marijan refused to leave. The gatekeeper refused to leave. And it was a classic kind of setup of like, modern science versus backwards mysticism versus rural magic, all this kind of stuff. Classic kind of modernist tale. The volcano erupted on one night and ended up killing the gatekeeper. And it was a massive sensation across Indonesia. There was mourning across Indonesia for him. And a lot of people thought that it also proved this classic modernist narrative of reason and science versus superstition and mysticism and magic. So far, so good. Science wins. 6 years later, rather, the same scientist who came out to criticize the gatekeeper as believing in voodoo and magic and mysticism ended up joining the ritual procession to the gatekeeper's village where his mausoleum was. And it was a huge public moment. Everybody knew that he was there, that the scientist was returning to the village, to the very site of the death of the gatekeeper and the source of their conflict. He was later interviewed in a national magazine where he came out and he said, I now completely support the mystical system that the gatekeeper represented and upheld. And I completely support it because there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I'll tell you one in particular. In his village, it was no longer acceptable to give offerings to springs and like traditional sources of sustenance, because it was seen as being anti-Islamic. So essentially what the scientist was understanding was that the rise of monotheist Islam is a real danger to these mystical, magical practices. And so I'm going to use my authority to try and leverage the politics of the rise of monotheist Islam. And I'm going to do that by celebrating this old practice of giving offerings to the volcano. So he completely flipped around. And I think that this is the kind of story that really, for me, encapsulates what political geology is, in the sense that magic, as we were describing earlier, is something which is invoked. I don't want to say that it's simply instrumental, because it's not, but it's something about the kind of slipperiness of reality or something that allows this kind of porosity, this essential porosity between modern science and Javanese mysticism.
This is so fascinating what you write, because you create not just a relation, I mean, it's a relationship between science and magic, but also science, magic, and religion. And in relation to religion, magic can find itself allied to science, which is also quite unexpected, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask about some of the influences or philosophical frameworks that you've worked with in interpreting what you encountered in this way. So in the past, you've spoken about Philippe d'Escola as an inspiration. How has he impacted your work?
That whole what was and is called ontological anthropology was really inspiring to me, because it, at least in the way that I read it, it placed controversies and conflicts around the nature of reality at the very center of its system. So it really kind of gave me the energy to spend time thinking about what it means when you can have somebody say that a volcano is the result of global plate tectonics, and somebody else say, actually, the volcano is full of my ancestors, and to not smooth over what are actually radically different conceptions of the being of the world. And that part of what it means to be is to negotiate, to leverage those different conceptions with each other. So one of the classic moves of geography, say, is to say that, well, what culture does is it's a bunch of worldviews that are projected onto nature, and nature itself is one thing. There's one nature, but what we have are multiple cultures. Geographers love to do this, and the discipline itself has participated in the production of this very model. because it's just, it's gone out and it's described the world and it says this is the world as it is. And then there's many different cultures, each with different interpretations of what that world is. So what ontological anthropologists have done that I found really inspiring is to short circuit that relationship and to say that actually maybe there isn't just a singular nature outside of culture. Maybe there's actually multiple worlds. And to really kind of give the full reality that we can to statements like the volcano is full of my ancestors. It could be very easy to dismiss that as being like, that's just your worldview, but actually the volcano is the product of global plate tectonics. So what I was really excited by in reading Ontological Anthropologists was to say, actually, what if you take that seriously, that the volcano is made of ancestors? If you give an offering to a volcano and you deposit something onto its slopes, there's an idea there that that thing that you're depositing is actually going somewhere. There are spirits, the real spirits that are coming in and out of the volcano. And that's a really different conception then of, of what a volcano is.
And it also establishes this mutuality between the volcano and the person, right?
Yes.
Which is where what you've discovered becomes not only another way of understanding the world that's interesting as a fascinating curiosity, but is a way of living that's more sustainable, that makes sense environmentally, which is what's so fascinating about this convergence between the magical and the ecological. And I think that this may be related to another term that comes up in your book that I found very beautiful and I'd like to hear more about, which is geopoetics, which you describe as something quite different from poetry about the earth. Rather, it is a making of connections, connecting the largest and smallest scales of the universe and from the present to deep time. Could you say more about geopoetics and how it's connected to what we've been talking about with political geology?
GeoPoetics is the product of a geologist called Johan Umgrove, who's a Dutch colonial geologist who worked in Java in the 1920s. As far as I can tell, he coins the term. I haven't been able to find it used before him, and it has been used since, but he's often kind of written out of the story. And part of why it's so interesting is because he's a real geologist. He's a real scientist who conceived of his project as one of geopoetics. And he did so really, I think, well in Java. So he spends 3 years there circulating between volcanoes and studying coral reefs in the Bay of Batavia, north of Jakarta. And he returns after that to write 2 books in the Netherlands in the 1940s, The Symphony of the Earth and The Pulse of the Earth. And these are his vast, systematic, syncretic works on the origin of the Earth, the history of the solar system, all the way down to biological evolution. And his project is to try and connect all of those things. And he calls that project GeoPoetics. So essentially, it's a kind of ecological project because he understands really explicitly that everything is connected. One of the things that he does in the first volume, in The Pulse of the Earth, is he begins with the rotation of what he understood to be the periods of cyclical rotation of the solar system, which he had thought, according to other scientists at the time, was about every 200 to 300 million years. And what he's fascinated by is really the problem of cycles. And how is it that all of nature is defined by cycles? So the rotation of the solar system down to the rhythms of days and nights and seasons. In between that is like glaciation, the rising and falling of sea levels, the rising and falling of levels of carbon, and species differentiation and extinction. So GeoPoetics is this project of scientific geological project of making connections between all of these different rhythms. And he ends at a place where he defines his system as one of complementarity, which he says is probably also the exact same thing as the Upanishads. So he's really well read. He's reading world religious traditions. And he also says that really the universe is a giant polyphonic symphony. And what it does is produces difference and complexity. And with every new production of difference is ever more the ever increasing production of complexity. And that's GeoPoetics.
That's so beautiful. And it brings me to another aspect of the way you describe these practices that you sometimes refer to as mysticism and sometimes as folk magic, sometimes as shamanism, which is this idea of tuning in and of listening to pulses. So an expression that you use to translate a technique that you encountered during your field work. It reminds me of what Timothy Morton writes about ecological thinking, that it's a form of attunement or attention to what's around us. And it's striking that this concept also appears in your work as something to think with when it comes to understanding what these practices are about, and in a way, how to engage with them as something more than just, as we were talking about before, a kind of a distant curiosity, but as practices that have political relevance. So yeah, could you say more about tuning in, how it might relate to GeoPoetics?
I first came across the idea of tuning when I was hanging out with friends on Merapi up at the top. I would hang out with men who they sort of have kind of like salons. It's almost like philosophical salons in the evening. They get together in their sitting room and they talk philosophy and politics. And one of them was talking about how it was that he and his friend, my friend Suparno, tuned into each other in such a way that they didn't have to use telephones to communicate. And they knew when each other were going to show up at each other's houses, and they knew what each other's troubles were. And they just had to tune into each other. And this project of tuning was something which could happen with anything. So Suparno would do these sort of meditative practices with chickens and scorpions and stuff, trying to tune into them. And one of the things that they did in describing this was talked about it specifically like a radio. And that they said that nature is essentially like a radio, and you just have a dial, and you have to learn how to tune in to a particular frequency in order to connect with it. And it struck me as interesting that it was an infrastructural idea of nature, and that it was using the idea of a technology, the radio technology, as a model for how the world works. So, we do know that, like in the history of magic, like the importance of the telephone, for instance, right? And how There's so many historical precedents of people speaking to the spiritual world through telephones, that when telephones were first introduced, people thought that they could speak to the dead and the long lost dead and things like that. And so I came to be interested in this kind of confluence then between a mystical practice and technology. And one of the ways that we conventionally think about mysticism is that it's about kind of direct, unmediated contact with God or the spirit world. But mysticism in Java is not at all about a lack of mediation. It's not at all about direct contact. It's like completely about technologies of mediation. So I came to then think much more deeply about how mysticism was a kind of technological practice. And what struck me in spending more time with my friends on Merapi was how they really are at a kind of impoverished edge of Indonesia. They're sort of barely in the cash economy. Yet the technologies of the state are kind of all around them. There's radios, there's televisions, there's these large radio towers. And for many of them, there's real frustration about the state of Indonesia itself. There's an association of the state with corruption, with ineptitude, with really nothing but like failing to protect or take care of them. So when I came to think about them talking about tuning into each other, using a kind of model of a radio for each other, without relying on the actual radio, which is developed by the Indonesian state, which they are so frustrated by, it seemed to me that mysticism was, again, this completely political act of building an infrastructure that was a kind of counter infrastructure to the Indonesian state. It pulled the model of the radio into their world in such a way that they no longer had to rely on the Indonesian state for a radio or for communication. They could do it themselves. And that seems really powerful to me.
And when they tuned into non-human creatures, like you were talking about scorpions and chickens, what was the purpose of those activities?
Well, I think that it was really about getting to know the other beings that you live with, quite simply, rather than them sort of just being accoutrement of your world. They're actually really integral to it. So tuning in was a way of appreciating and deepening how integral they are.
And did you ever try doing it yourself?
Not really. I mean, I try all the time, I guess. I mean, I think in a certain way we all do. You know, so I've been getting into composting recently at my community garden, and I've been really excited about it. And I think there's a certain sense of tuning in. It's like how it is that you learn about something that you don't know about, and sort of it's bodily, it's physical, it's spatial, trial and error. And I think that the language of tuning in for my friends in Kuningad is a kind of just a developed way, I think, to acknowledge what it is to learn from something.
And that brings me to my final question relating to this idea of learning with and to magic as and mysticism, as you say, seen as a technology, not simply as a particular idea about reality or kind of symbolic language through which we interpret it, but really a technology for transforming our modes of perception. And I think this is something which is often misunderstood about these practices, that they are practices, that they're very pragmatic. Again, something that came up in our conversation in an earlier episode with Isabel Stengers about how experimental and really empirical these phenomena are. And that when we engage with them in this way, we see that they are not a contradiction to techno fixes and the quote unquote hard sciences, but really a kind of complement to them. And it's when we separate the two that we run into problems. It's when we think that the spiritual technologies are irrelevant to the hard tech, or that from the perspective of mysticism, that the hard tech is simply distraction from the true spiritual realities. Could you say more about this, between the relationship between sort of spiritual and the material there?
Yeah, I completely agree with you that it is a practice, that it is technical, infrastructural, pragmatic, empirical. It's full of negotiations. One of the things that I do throughout the book is to show how it is that modern volcanology is mystical, and then to show how modern mysticism in Java is also volcanological, is also modern science. So this is to return, I guess, to what we were saying earlier of this project of both insisting on some real differences between modern volcanological science and mysticism, but also how it is that they produce each other and are embedded in each other and influence each other in non-linear ways. And I think what it really comes down to for me is to show that modern volcanology needs mysticism. It needs Javanese mysticism. Javanese mysticism solves all sorts of problems, all sorts of deficiencies with modern volcanology. And the reverse is true as well. So I guess it is, what I'm saying is that they produce each other. But I'm not really sure also. I don't know. You've sort of taken me to a place that's like really fundamentally difficult for me. I don't have a concise or a succinct way to capture it.
I think you've captured it really well. And also the place of uncertainty is appropriate for this question, really. Well, thank you, Adam, for taking the time to speak with us on the podcast. It's been really extraordinary hearing about your work and the relationship between science, magic, ecology, religion, poetics that you've been laying out. Listeners who want to know more about your work, are there any upcoming projects that you're working on at the moment?
Many, but it's really the book, I guess, to look out for.
And now it only remains to thank you, the listeners, for tuning into the Insurrection Interviews podcast. The podcast is part of Magic and Ecology, a year-long series of talks and online events where we invite researchers thinking about magic in relation to ecology and practitioners working with magic to transform modes of earth living in order to enable collaborative thinking across disciplines and practices. Magic and Ecology is hosted by the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, and co-convened by Jördis Becker-Lindenthal, Sophie Lunn-Rockcliffe, and myself, Simone Kotber. For more information and details of how to sign up for our upcoming live online events in 2021, please visit our website at magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk.